Hello, my American Studies 140 students. This is Professor Collins. It is Monday. It is March 16th, 2020. And it is the start of week, what is this, week 10 in the course, right? Yeah, week 10. It's also the start of several weeks worth of recordings that I will be doing for you regarding what would normally be a lecture and prep for discussion and other things for the course on DC history and culture. We're supposed to be doing the second half of a 2-week unit around gentrification in Washington, D.C. and the DMV. We're in discussions this week, I hope, on Wednesday and or Saturday to pose questions to you regarding all of that. But first, I just want to go over a few things procedurally and acknowledge a few realities in the process of doing so. One, of course, is the fact that we're not meeting face-to-face the remainder of the semester. Things have changed since the last recording I did on Wednesday. 3 hours after I did that recording, AU decided that we will not be on campus the remainder of the semester to meet, which I think, given the way things are in the country and around the world, is probably a really good thing, right? But that means that you guys are cut off from library materials. That means in terms of your project, you cannot physically go and take pictures and meet people and so on and so forth. I'm just letting you know right now, just be as creative as possible with the project. Do not worry about, too many pictures or using music or, doing your presentation, wearing the cow pajamas or something. I actually want you to be as creative as possible while also covering material. So, most of you have laptops, most of you have internet access, most of you have some ability to digitize this project. For those with limited access, please let me know, via email or, Skype or what have you. You have my Skype handle for Wednesdays and other times, just let me know. Because I want everyone to get something out of this course, whatever we can pull out of this course, in terms of you getting something out of it the second half. I'm fine with. And that leads me to the other thing. I talked to you in video and I put in announcements the idea that you guys still might have a second paper to write regarding the Reese book and other materials on gentrification. No, you will not have a second paper. Your obligation is basically to show up to as many discussions as possible online, to do your readings, to do your project, and to do 2 remaining reflections on the schedule. That's it. That's all I expect. I don't expect you to do much else than that because this format is not set up to be, online format is so different from face to face. To expect you to just keep handing the assignments week after week without having the time to go over them in detail in terms of what I want and expect and so on. Yeah. So that's why. So that's it. Keeping things simple, but still tending to the main goals of the course, and trying to be flexible because not everyone has equal amounts of access to all the materials and all the technologies we need in order to make this class work. Not to mention the fact some of you might actually have coronavirus, right? And not know it. You can be completely asymptomatic and not know it. You could be tired and not know it. You could have a cold and not know that cold's actually coronavirus. So, I have to take that into account as well. So that's where we are, I think. I want to acknowledge the elephant in the room. And speaking of which, when we talk about gentrification this Wednesday, one of the questions I will pose will be related to access to health care and coronavirus and gentrification along those lines. I know none of our readings cover that, but I figure it will open the door for you to have more discussion about themes of the course while simultaneously weaving in some of whatever you might be feeling around what we're doing right now, what we're doing as a nation, what we're doing as a world right now around this issue. Yeah, I almost feel bad that I made my joke the second week about thinking that coronavirus is actually about Corona beer way back on January 22nd. So there's that. So, all right, that's for all the sort of details around what we're doing for the next few weeks, but I do want to summarize what I would have lectured on otherwise for week 10 around gentrification. And that is this. Now, in order to understand the DMV in Washington, D.C., in 2020, whether coronavirus free or not, you have to, gentrification is pretty central to that process. All the things that we went over in class 2 weeks ago on March the 4th around NIMBY, not in my backyard, around eminent domain, around suburbanization and how that basically depopulated certain sections of the city in terms of class status and racial status, meaning a lot of white folks left for a lot of middle class white folks and affluent whites left for the suburbs, and then blacks who became middle class, solidly working class, middle class, and even affluent also left in the period between roughly the late 60s and the beginning of the 21st century, roughly 1968 to 2000, but centered really in the 1980s and 90s, to Prince George's County and Howard County and Baltimore County, among other places. Right? Those are sort of the big themes that lead to the gentrification that happens in the late 90s and are with us to this day, that you saw some of in Acker, but you see even more of in the Reese book. And so where we are in terms of gentrification, that story around gentrification really centers around the efforts of government and corporations to remake the city. It's not just one or the other. You can argue that gentrification generally is a corporatized process where private companies come in to build high-rises and townhomes and McMansions and cul-de-sacs and other things in urban areas to bring more money into those cities. But that can't happen without government support, and a lot of government support. Tax breaks, tax increases even for the residents who live in the city. Other kinds of incentives to bring folks, to bring businesses, to bring certain kinds of commerce into these communities. That's a process that's been happening all across the country, obviously, over the last 20 or 30 years. But here in D.C., it has a particularly unique effect on a town that has been majority black had been majority black, I should say, for the better part of 6 decades. So when Anthony Williams starts announcing new contracts and contacts to bring businesses to Shaw, into Adams Morgan, into Georgetown, into parts northeast, including Deanwood, Trinidad, parts of what's now known as NOMA, which is north of Massachusetts Avenue, basically the nexus between Mass Ave and Florida Avenue in northeast Washington, D.C. H Street, H and Fifth, where Union Market happens to be located. All of those things are driven in part by private industry interest, particularly in housing, but also by government. And those incentives are not just D.C. government incentives, those are federal government incentives. All the stuff around the housing bubble that burst in 2007 and 2008 helped drive the gentrification in D.C. too. As property became more valuable, as homes became more valuable. And by the way, one of the great myths around home buying and home owning in D.C. is that a lot of homes you can own the home, but you can't own the land. That in fact you are renting land here. That's actually not true. Only 4% of homes in D.C. are on land that has to be rented from the federal government because it's actually federally protected land. 96% of the land in D.C., when you buy the home, you're buying the land just like you are everywhere else. So for those of you who have probably heard that wrinkle, it only applies to about 1 in 22 homes, right? And certainly maybe about as many businesses. So just keep that in mind. So basically the same process, but with the unique wrinkle of the federal government also being involved in that process. Right? But the housing bubble that led to the housing burst, that led to the Great Recession of 2008, also took off here as well, raising property prices and increase in taxes and so on and so forth. And then you add to all of that, you add to the active role of the D.C. government and city council in bringing in new businesses, particularly around housing and food, however bad that food might be, right? And you add to that the expansion of Metro to all the outlying suburbs and even within the city from 1999 on, and you have this massive booming massive building boom that takes place between roughly 1999 and is still ongoing. It's still ongoing. So within a decade, communities like Shaw, which are like 80, 90% black, become 45, 50% white in a span of a decade because of the building of all these new businesses and particularly apartment homes and luxury high rises and all of that. And with that comes the repavement of roads and streets, the building of new public works that aren't necessarily related to housing, new businesses, not just food, but other kinds of businesses, because people have money now. The change of places which would have been what we would call food deserts or grossly inadequate food access areas, like Trinidad, now, which at one point didn't have a Giant, didn't have a Trader Joe's, didn't have any of these things, and now it has all of these things and more. It's all driven by gentrification. But it's driven by gentrification that involves both government and private industry interests. And the folks, in the process of all that happening, that means tens of thousands of folks have been forced out of D.C. The estimate that the Washington Post puts out is roughly 30,000 people have been displaced through gentrification, mostly poor, mostly African American, in the period since 1999. Roughly 20,000 of them alone are from communities like Shaw and Detroit Park and Logan Circle in D.C. But it also includes folks from Berry Farm, and from Anacostia and other sections of the city as well. But the nexus of how gentrification has taken hold is really Shaw and U Street and Detroit Park and Logan Circle and the area right around that. And further to the east, down Florida Avenue is where you get to Trinidad and Noma, and there's been some displacement as well there. And I'm pretty sure you folks have noticed the homelessness in D.C. That homelessness has been on the rise as gentrification has taken fuller hold in D.C. over this period. So keep that in mind too. So when you go through the readings like the Reese reading on black food geographies, the second half of that readings and how communities are coping with gentrification and with the loss of neighbors and certain types of businesses for other types of businesses. Or look at the Kurzuius article that deals with Shaw's Metro PCS store and the controversy over its playing of loud go-go music during business hours, and how that has led to folks who are gentrifiers, as the term is technically used, not so technically used. They go after businesses for doing what they've been doing for years, or the whole issue of walking dogs on the quad or the Mecca, as it's called, of Howard University and letting them poop in the middle of that quad or having picnics out there while students are going to school and saying that they have equal rights, if not more rights, to this area than Howard University does, even though Howard University's been around for 153 years, right? Those kinds of things, right? So those are the kinds of articles that you are reading this week that deal with what gentrification has done to DC and the sort of class and race-based sort of elitism that comes with the gentrification as well, and the fights between people who are longtime members of these communities, usually African American, and those who are moving in, who are usually, but not always, white. There are certainly black and African black and Latinx folk who happen to be of color, moving into cities with their wealth and affluence, wanting the city to look a certain way too. So the city is in a battle with itself over how the city is transforming culturally, how it's transforming in terms of its physical look, how it's transforming in terms of the relationships between neighbors and people within this city. And to add to that, I want you to think about, in addition to all of that, the fact that now that we are in the midst of a pandemic, what does that mean in a city like Washington, D.C., where people are divided in terms of class and race and gender and geography, right, in terms of access to certain things, public health facilities, among others, healthy food at this point in time, medicines, among other things? And so these are all things for you to think about for this week for discussion. I'll post questions around all of this for you to consider. I will I will go through a couple of those questions during discussion on Wednesday and or on Saturday as well. And also, and finally, in terms of thinking through your projects and thinking through this particular discussion, I will post also in content some additional readings. Nothing major, just the readings I discussed 2 weeks ago at the beginning of class, and also a sample of the PowerPoint presentation and the executive summary that a group of students did last semester for my class that deals specifically with Union Market, the place that I wanted to take you to see this Saturday, but obviously we're not doing that. So the next best thing is for me to show you their presentation and maybe see if you can look at that and get some inspiration about how to do your projects that way, as well as around gentrification and what gentrification has done to this particular neighborhood. That's it. Send me an email if you have any questions. Hopefully I'll see you, some of you, if not most of you, on Skype this week. And everybody stay healthy and good luck.